Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a topic today that I know has been on a lot of your minds lately, that intersection of intuition, manifestation, and the science behind actually achieving what you desire.
And we've got a really interesting set of sources to dig into this time, articles, interviews, all focused on the brain and how we can sort of hack it for success.
I love it. You guys know how much I love to geek out on the whole neuroscience thing, and it seems like our brains really are the key players here, right?
Totally. And this Dr. Tara Swart, whose work keeps popping up in what you
Yeah.
sent, she's a neuroscientist, but also an MD. So she bridges that gap between like hard science and practical
Oh,
application.
perfect. And someone who speaks both languages. Okay, so where do we even begin? I'm seeing gut instinct and sixth sense. Is this getting kind of mystical?
Not as out there as it sounds, actually. It all ties back to this thing called interoception, basically. It's your body's ability to sense its internal state.
So like when you just know you need another cup of coffee.
Way more than that. It's how you know you're hungry before your stomach rumbles, or how you can tell you're coming down with something before any symptoms even hit. It's your internal radar.
Okay, that's kind of cool actually. But is that really a sixth sense? Like I thought we only had five.
Well, think about it. Those five senses, they're all about how we perceive the outside world, right? Interoception is all about tuning into what's going on inside. And Dr. Swart argues it's just as important, if not more so.
So it's like we really do have this whole inner world that we're often not even paying attention to.
Exactly. And the more we can tap into those subtle cues, the better we become at making decisions, managing our energy, even just feeling more connected to ourselves.
That makes sense. So how do we actually do that? How do we get better at listening to our gut, so to speak?
That's where practices like mindfulness and meditation come in. By slowing down, paying attention to our breath, we start to notice those subtle sensations we might normally miss.
So creating that space to actually feel what's going on inside.
Right. And it's not just about our own internal state either. Dr. Swart talks about how we're constantly picking up on other people's energy too, especially where it comes to stress.
Ooh, I've definitely felt that before, like walking into a room and just knowing something's off. But how does that even work? Are we mind readers now?
Not quite,
Yeah.
but our bodies are actually communicating all the time through these invisible chemical signals called hormones. And cortisol, the stress hormone, it plays a big role here.
Right, cortisol, everyone's favorite. But so how does that work between people?
It's like our bodies are constantly releasing and receiving these hormonal signals. So you walk into that meeting, and even if your boss isn't saying anything, you might pick up on their elevated cortisol levels, and bam, you start feeling stressed too.
So it's like our own internal alarm system is going off, even if we don't consciously realize why.
Exactly. And that's why being more aware of our own internal state is so important. Because if we're not careful, we end up just reacting to everyone else's energy instead of responding from a place of, our own inner knowing.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So our bodies are these incredible communication systems, both internally and with the people around us. But what about like our past experiences? How does that all factor in? If we're talking about manifestation and creating our reality, don't our past experiences, especially from childhood, kind of shape how we view the world?
Absolutely. And that's where neuroplasticity comes in, this idea that our brains are constantly changing and adapting based on our experiences. It's actually a really hopeful concept.
Okay, so our brains aren't just static. We're not stuck with whatever wiring we were born with.
Exactly. Think of it like walking through a forest. The more you travel a particular path, the more defined it becomes. Same thing with our brains. Every experience, every thought, every emotion, it's literally shaping those neural pathways.
So even if we have some negative experiences in our past, some less than ideal pathways, we're not stuck with them forever. We can create new ones.
Exactly. But here's the thing, those early experiences, especially in childhood, they tend to create some pretty deep-seated beliefs about ourselves and the world.
Oh, that makes sense. Like if you grew up constantly hearing you weren't good enough, that could really stick with you, even if it's not true.
Absolutely. And those beliefs often operate on a subconscious level, so we might not even be aware of how they're influencing our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
So even if we're consciously trying to manifest amazing things, those hidden beliefs could be sabotaging us without us even realizing it.
Exactly. It's like having one foot on the gas and the other on the brake. You're not going to get very far, are you? And that's where the idea of shadow work comes in, right? Dr. Swart talks about this a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Confronting those hidden parts of ourselves. But how do we even begin to do that? Sounds kind of scary, honestly.
It can be challenging for sure, but it's not about like dwelling on the negative or anything. It's more about bringing those subconscious beliefs into the light of awareness so we can start to, well, rewire them.
Okay, that makes it less intimidating. So how does that rewiring actually work? Do we need, like, a brain surgeon?
Huh. No, thankfully not. Dr. Swart talks about some surprisingly practical tools we can all use. Journaling, for one, can be super powerful.
Oh yeah, journaling. Everyone says to do it, but I always end up just complaining about my day. How do we actually use it for this kind of deep work?
It's about asking yourself the right questions, I think. Like, what are some negative beliefs I have about myself? Or what experiences might have contributed to those beliefs? Just getting curious, you
So
know?
instead of, "Dear diary, I had the worst day," it's more like, "Dear diary, why do I always think I'm going to mess things up?"
Exactly. And once you start identifying those limiting beliefs, you can start challenging them. Like, is it really true that you always mess things up? Or is that just an old story you've been telling yourself?
Ooh, I like that, challenging the story.
Mm.
What else did she recommend? Besides the journaling, I mean.
Affirmations are another big one.
Affirmations, right. But don't those always feel kind of cheesy? Like I'm trying to trick myself into believing something that isn't true?
I used to think that too, but it's actually about consciously choosing what thoughts we're feeding our brains, right? Because
Mhm.
those thoughts, even the cheesy ones, they create real neural pathways.
The more we repeat those positive affirmations, the more our brains start to actually believe them. It's like that forest path thing again. We're literally carving out new pathways with our thoughts.
Exactly. And that's how we start to shift those deep-seated beliefs that might be holding us back. But she's also really big on emphasizing that this is a process, not a quick fix.
Right. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither were our brains, I guess. But even if it takes time, knowing we have the power to change those patterns, that's huge. Okay, so we're working on rewriting those limiting beliefs, but how does that actually play into manifestation? Because that's another thing I feel like has become super popular, but also kind of misunderstood.
Totally. And it can get really new agey really fast. But Dr. Swart brings in this really grounded scientific perspective on it, which I appreciate. She's basically saying that the law of attraction, this idea that we attract what we focus on, it's not magic, it's just how our brains work.
Okay, so explain that to me like I'm 5, because I think my brain needs a little rewiring on this whole thing.
So our brains are bombarded with so much information every second, right? Like it's overwhelming how much is coming at us constantly. So to cope, our brains have to filter all that out and decide what's important.
Makes sense. So it's like our brain is scrolling through a million channels and trying to decide which one to watch.
Exactly. And that's where our attention comes in. Whatever we focus on, whatever we give our energy to, our brains decide, oh, this must be important, and they start paying more attention to it. So if we're constantly focusing on lack or what we don't have, guess what we're more likely to see and experience?
More lack. Oh man, that's not what I wanted to hear, but it makes total sense.
Yeah, it's not always fun to realize how much power our thoughts have. But the good news is, if we can learn to shift our focus to the positive, to what we do want to create, our brains will start looking for those things, and we're more likely to manifest them in our lives.
So it's not about ignoring the negative entirely. It's more about choosing where we direct that mental spotlight.
Exactly. And it's not always easy, especially if we have those old thought patterns ingrained in our neural pathways. But the more we practice, the easier it gets.
It's like training our brains to become manifestation magnets,
Hmm.
basically. Love it. But how does all of this tie in with happiness? If we're always striving for more, always focused on what we want to manifest, how do we find contentment in the present moment? Because I feel like that's a big part of the puzzle too, right?
It is. It's like, how do we balance that drive to grow, to achieve, with just like enjoying where we are right now?
Right, because nobody wants to get so caught up in chasing the next big thing that they miss out on the beauty of what's right in front of them. Did Dr. Swart talk about that?
Well, yeah, she did. She actually shared this quote that really stuck with me. The gap between being and becoming is the greatest source of unhappiness.
Ooh, that's deep.
Yeah.
And so true, right? We're always thinking, I'll be happy when. But then when finally arrives, and there's always another when right behind it.
Totally. And it creates this constant feeling of dissatisfaction, like we're never quite good enough as we are. So her whole thing is, how do we bridge that gap? How do we find contentment now while still striving for our goals?
Yeah, because I don't think it's about just giving up on our dreams and being like, well, this is it, I guess.
Right, exactly. It's about finding that balance. And one thing she talks about that I think is really helpful is gratitude. like actively practicing gratitude for what we already have.
Okay, so instead of focusing on all the things we don't have yet,
Mhm.
we're shifting that mental spotlight to appreciate the good stuff that's already present in our lives.
Exactly. And that could be like really simple things too. Your health, the people you love, a sunny day. It's about training our brains to focus on abundance, not lack.
So more of those positive sticky notes for our
Yeah.
brains, reminding us of all the good stuff.
I like it.
Okay, I have to ask about one more thing before we wrap up, because it really caught my attention when I was going through the materials you sent. Near-death experiences. Whoa. Did Dr. Swart really go there?
She did, which, for a neuroscientist, it's definitely venturing into some pretty out there territory. But even though her background is in science, she's also really open to exploring the mysteries of consciousness that we don't fully understand yet.
Which I think is so cool. It's like, even with all her knowledge and expertise, she's still curious and open-minded.
Yeah.
So what did she say about near-death experiences? Because I feel like there's so many different beliefs and theories about those.
Right, and it's a topic that can be really sensitive too, so I think she approached it with a lot of respect and, like you said, curiosity. She was particularly interested in this phenomenon called terminal lucidity. Have you heard of that?
I don't think so. Tell me more.
So it's when people who are really close to death, like in a coma or maybe they have severe dementia, and then suddenly, right before they pass, they have this surge of mental clarity.
Wow, really? But how is that even possible if their brain is shutting down?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And I don't think anyone has a definitive answer yet. But it does make you wonder, like, what else don't we know about the brain and consciousness? And could there be more to us than just our physical bodies?
Right. It definitely opens up some wild possibilities.
Totally. And I think Dr. Swart would be the first to say that we don't have all the answers. But asking those big questions, being open to exploring those mysteries, that's where things get really interesting.
Absolutely. It's like that saying, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. Which is kind of exciting, actually. It means there's always more to discover.
Exactly. Okay, I know we've covered a ton of ground today, maybe left everyone's brains feeling a little full. What's one big takeaway you're walking away with?
That's a good one. I think for me, it's that we have so much more power than we realize. Like, we're not just victims of circumstance or our past experiences or even our own brains. We can actually learn to understand how our brains work and then use that knowledge to create the reality we want.
Yes, I love that. It's about taking back our power, becoming conscious creators of our own lives. And, it's not always easy. It takes effort. It takes practice, but it's possible.
So well said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. To all our amazing listeners out there, keep those brains buzzing, keep asking those big questions, and never underestimate the incredible power of your own mind. We'll catch you in our next deep dive.